Hello, and welcome to the first lecture for Theater 232, History of Theater to 1900. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between drama and theater, some of the necessary elements of theater, the difference between reading a play and reading other things, and then an introduction to theater history, some of the concepts that we'll be covering in this course, and finally, a little bit about oral performance and some of the developments of performance traditions in early human history. So first, we'll talk about the difference between drama and theater. And this is talked about in your textbooks, but just to reiterate, when you're talking about drama, we're usually talking about a written text, a piece of literature. When we're talking about theater, we're most often discussing not just a work of literature, or maybe not even a work of literature at all, but the actual action of theater in a space, in a production, with an audience, and production elements. Now, of course, this can be anything from an ancient ritual performance with nothing like what we think of when we're talking about modern theater, or it can indicate something more modern and more like what we think of as conventional, traditional theater nowadays. One thing that we can say about theater, though, is that there are four necessary elements that any act of theater will have. And I'm saying these in no particular order. We'll discuss them many times over the course of the semester, and they'll actually be used as the sort of framing devices for how we talk about the different eras in human history, and we'll discuss these four elements. So the elements are actors, text. Text in this case can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't, again, have to be a literary text or a play as we think of it. It might be a story or some other mode of storytelling. The third is space. Obviously, theater has to take place in a space somewhere. And it always takes place in real time. And the last thing that theater, the last necessary element of theater is audience. Obviously, this is something that is necessary to make it from something differing from a rehearsal or just a group of people coming together to do something amongst themselves. And this distinguishes it from some kinds of ritual ceremonies where there isn't necessarily an audience, but in fact they are all participants. So those are the four necessary elements of theater that we'll talk about as a framing device for our conversations this semester: actors, text, space, and audience. One of the things to think about as you're thinking about a play in production versus a play being read is the numbers of interpreters. If you're reading a play, you're reading a drama, if you will, then if you think about the interpretation, it's happening in your head, in your imagination. You're able to fill up the visual part of the material in your head, and this is why we often think about plays the way that we think, in a way that is difficult to express when we actually try to make them into concrete things. So if a play takes place in a modern apartment, for example, in our head, of course, we can imagine an entire apartment. On stage, creating an apartment is a different project, right? You actually have to figure out what elements of the apartment are we building. How will the audience look at this apartment? What will it look like? Does it have four walls? Well, if it has four walls, where's the audience? If it has three walls, then which wall are you eliminating, and how does that work? In a production, you have multiple interpreters that are creating the concrete physical images and actions that happen in a theatrical production. Again, using the contrast of reading, when you have actors playing characters, they're no longer how you imagine a character to look or act in your head, but instead take on the characteristics of the actor and the decisions that the actor and the director has made in order to interpret that character. And then again, of course, you also have, in addition to that, the audience who are in their different individual ways interpreting the actions of those characters. That's just the example of the actor. If you think about the text, right, you also have multiple interpretations as opposed to the one that's just inside your head. And you can think about this in terms of many of the elements of theater, how each of them has multiple interpretations, not just what's going on inside your head. When you read a play, therefore, for this class, for the purposes of looking at theater from a historical perspective, it's very important to think about how the story is told in a live setting to an audience and what kind of performance it suggests. And we'll be studying a lot about the different historical contexts so that we can get some idea about what those contexts would have looked like, what those performances would have looked like, not just reading the literary texts and trying to deduce how and what they mean through simply reading them as dramas. We're going to be trying to look at them as acts of theater. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about theater history and the very idea of history as theater and theater as history. And one of the concepts that I like to use is the idea of the mask. The mask is a term that has many connotations. In normal life, we talk about people having masks, hiding themselves. It has psychological connotations, right, where someone can take on a mask. In theater, of course, the masks are the iconic symbols of theater from Greek tragedy and comedy, right? The tragic mask and the comic mask. It's a representative icon of the theater because of its importance to the Greek theater. But it's also a symbol for theater that has more significance than it might initially seem to. For example, there's always something behind the mask, something that has to have come before the mask was created and embodied. For our purposes, it serves nicely to describe the relationship of theater to history. A mask is something we, or an audience, sees in the present, but it has been created and filled by an actor delivering some sort of verbal and/or physical text, telling a story. However, the object or person behind the mask is obscured, is covered up to some extent, which makes it unclear what is hiding behind that mask. What is behind the mask is just some of what theater history explores, not to destroy the illusion of the mask, but to understand the theatrical event. The primary evidence we have to figure out the history of theater is in the playtexts that have survived the centuries and millennia. Through these texts, we can figure out all sorts of valuable information about what the theaters looked like, how and when the actors moved, what kind of theater technology was in use, and of course the thematic and narrative tastes and interests of the theater community. It's important to recognize, however, that this means we have a necessarily and extremely fragmentary view of theater history. The ways that these plays were performed, what the audiences were like, and what their expectations were, what was truly surprising, for example, provocative, shocking, are not known with much certainty. These are things that we can only determine through fragmentary evidence. If we compare this historical perspective to how we look at theater today, we can see, however, that it's not that different. Theater, by its very nature, is a temporary, fleeting form of art. It is constantly disappearing and reappearing in new and changed forms. Even the same piece performed by the same group of people changes from performance to performance. Those of you who have acted in plays know this. If you've not seen a theatrical performance yourself, it's difficult to determine what the piece really looked and sounded like, because even a good video frames the work in new ways and shifts the perspectives that would have been available in the live performance. In this way, then, the study of theater history, with all its difficulties and fragmentary sources of evidence, is also a metaphor for the act of an audience viewing any theatrical performance at any time in history. Just like we will explore and try to determine some meaning from some of these important texts in Western and Asian theater, an audience going to a matinee on Broadway also has the difficult job of extracting meaning from the performances they're seeing. While some texts and some periods obviously provide more difficulties for us than others, the nature of the theatrical event is nonetheless one in which various meanings and interpretations are constantly being explored and examined. While it's always in the present, and never the same, theater is a form that is still always dependent on history. Whether it's the relatively brief moment between a new play being written and performed, to the production of a Greek tragedy on a contemporary stage, history is always present in the theater. The stories that are told in theater, as we will explore this semester, have always depended upon history and precedents. I ask you to think about some of your favorite plays or musicals and think about the kind of source materials that they use. And I can guarantee you that almost all of them have some sort of previous source or previous iteration, whether on stage or in some other form. The Greeks and Shakespeare provide great examples, as both willfully took and rendered familiar mythologies and histories and made them into new and contemporary feeling theatrical works. It's not just the stories, however, that come from the past, from history. As Marvin Carlson states in his book, The Haunted Stage, Quote, "The retelling of stories already told, the reenactment of events already enacted, the re-experience of emotions already experienced. These are and have always been central concerns of the theater in all times and places. But closely allied to these concerns are the particular production dynamics of theater, the stories it chooses to tell, the bodies and other physical materials it utilizes to tell them, and the places in which they are told. Each of these production elements are also, to a striking degree, composed of materials that we have seen before, and the memory of that recycled material as it moves through new and different productions contributes in no small measure to the richness and density of the operations of theater in general as a site of memory, both personal and cultural." End quote. Carlson is talking about the presence of the past in theater, which is exactly what we will be looking at through our historical explorations this semester. Because in the end, we're not studying history to know history, but to see how the theater has developed and how what we have learned from past practitioners and theorists can help us configure our own theatrical perspectives and creations. The fragmentation of evidence and the impossibility of true recreation is not just a problem of historical methods. It is in fact the nature of theatrical creation and performance. Because a theatrical event can never be recreated, each and every theatrical event is something new. History is not useless, but its fragmentary and often uncertain nature makes every examination of theater history and every act of theater an act of interpretation and creation. This does not, of course, mean that theater history is random and meaningless. On the contrary, there's far too much valuable information. In this course, we will try to examine individual periods and plays from periods of time when theater was particularly vibrant and active. This course is by no means exhaustive, but in the end, hopefully, seeing the shifts and movements of plays and practices will help us understand more about how theater has gotten to where it is today and where it might be heading in the future. We'll concentrate on texts, but also study theatrical spaces, historical, political, religious, and mythological contexts in order to explore the means of creation and how they may have affected audiences. We'll also constantly be connecting what we see in the theater with the culture in which it existed. To do this, we'll also be looking at things not associated directly with traditional theater. In doing this combination of studies, we'll find many ghosts. Ghosts from texts we've already read, ghosts from other non-dramatic texts, ghosts from historical events, from mythology and religious stories, and from places and spaces of performance. We will see how these various elements affect the creation and performance of works of theater, and how we today can deal with and exploit this history to help us understand and create our own theater. We will begin with ritual origins of performance in theater, which, as we'll discover, still serve as ghosts of sorts, the objects behind the mask for much of the semester. The metaphor that the text, Theater Histories, is using is not that of ghosts, but is of mapping. We will, along with that text, map the different ways we look at and study theater, keeping in our minds the various differences and perspectives that time, culture, and other factors necessitate.